Thank you, and good morning, everyone. How come that someone as old as I am gets invited to give the opening presentation at this important HRB conference on trust in health research? It's because Declan Devane lured me out of retirement by telling me I could use my 30 minutes on any topic I wanted. I've been concerned for 52 years about the way that flawed ethical analyses have undermined the need to reduce uncertainties about the effects of treatments. I approach this issue from the perspective of a patient and a citizen, but informed by what I learned as a health professional. Although my frequent appeals for better ethical analyses have had no discernible practical effects, I invite you to join me in considering the following question, which is on my first slide. So the question I want you to join me in addressing is, can unaccountable research ethics committees be trusted to help protect patients and the public? This booklet was produced by the General Medical Council in the UK as guidance for doctors towards good medical practice. It contained this statement within it. You must work with colleagues and patients to maintain and improve the quality of your work and promote patient safety. In particular, you must help to resolve uncertainties about the effects of treatments. Let me give you one example of the kind of uncertainty which has influenced me. Way back in the 1950s, in fact, beginning in the 1940s, it was believed by some people, on the basis of actually very unsatisfactory evidence, that if women who'd had miscarriages previously in pregnancies or stillbirths were given a drug called diethylstilbestrol, that the outcome of their subsequent pregnancy could be improved. Now, there were two reactions to this claim. One was by obstetricians who did controlled trials which found no evidence that this was a useful treatment. Other people carried on regardless. The first group obviously gave up giving it because there was no evidence that it was useful. Lots and lots of women were exposed to this drug, particularly in North America, but also in the British Isles. And it wasn't until the late 1960s that it turned out that this drug was causing cancers in the female fetuses, female babies of women who'd taken the drug. Devastating. Now, I'll come back to this statement and this particular example a little later on in this talk. I just want you to bear that one in mind. Now, the question I ask is, ethicists and research regulators should also help to address uncertainty about the effects of their treatments, their working methods, and their prescriptions and proscriptions for others. Just like health professionals should do for their prescriptions and proscriptions. Back in 2007, an article was published in which I concluded that ethicists and research regulators had contributed to the avoidable suffering and deaths of millions of people, the vast majority of whom had not been participants in research. In an article published in the BMJ 11 years earlier, a medical ethicist, the chair of a large research ethics committee, and I posed the following question. Are research ethics committees behaving unethically? The first issue that we brought to the attention of our readers was that research ethics committees are behaving unethically by endorsing new research which is unnecessary. That was our first charge. And this is the plot that we used to illustrate why we made this point. This shows the results of totting up with each new trial the data concerned with testing whether antibiotic prophylaxis reduced perioperative deaths in people undergoing surgery for colorectal cancer. And what you'll see is that by the mid-1970s, there was fairly confident evidence that this was a useful treatment. And it could have been questioned why any further trials were done. In fact, 10 or a dozen more trials were done. Why did the ethics committees who were considering whether these trials should be done, why did they approve of withholding what was by that time a very promising, if not important, treatment prophylaxis for colorectal surgery, and allowed, in essence, half of the women in those trials to be treated only with a placebo? That's the fundamental question. This is another example of a cumulative meta-analysis, this time for thrombolytic therapy for people having heart attacks. And there again, you'll see that from the mid-70s onwards, there was really very confident evidence that this was a life-saving treatment for people having heart attacks. So what were the ethics committees doing, approving all these subsequent trials? Would any of the members of those ethics committees be happy to be assigned to placebo if they had a heart attack? So, verdict number one is that patients are exposed to unnecessary risks in studies that haven't taken account of systematic reviews of existing evidence. Limited resources for research continue to be squandered on unnecessary research. And my challenge is, are ethicists and research ethics committees reducing these problems? We made two recommendations in our paper to deal with this particular problem. First one, require systematic reviews of existing research before approving research. And second, require that a summary of relevant systematic reviews be made available to potential participants in those trials. Second charge concerned the fact that research ethics committees are behaving unethically by acquiescing in biased underreporting of research, which they have approved. Note, biased underreporting of research was recognized by an Irishman more than 3 centuries ago. Here he is, looking very dogger in his beautiful clothes, Robert Boyle, and you'll see down at the bottom there a reference to a lovely article in the James Lind Library by Dorothy Bishop and Eon Gill from Waterford. He said this: many excellent notions or experiments are by sober and modest men suppressed. And needless to say, he thought that was a bad practice. Here's an example of the costs of biased underreporting of research. It concerns antiarrhythmic drugs in heart attack. It was written up by Cowley and his colleagues, who deserve a great deal of credit for being straightforward about this. They said, when we carried out our study in 1980, many years earlier, we thought that the increased death rate that occurred in the drug group was an effect of chance. The development of the drug was abandoned for commercial reasons, and this study was therefore never published. It's now a good example of publication bias. The results described here might have provided an early warning of trouble ahead. What trouble ahead? At the peak of their use, these drugs have been estimated to have caused between 20 and 70,000 premature deaths every year in the United States alone. There continues to be underreporting, biased underreporting of controlled trials on a massive scale. By that, I mean that 1 in 2 trials that have been done don't get reported in public. Now, I've shown at the bottom a bar which shows that this need not be the case. This is in fact the trials supported by the UK Health Technology Assessment Programme, and it shows that virtually 100% have been reported. So verdict 2 is that patients and research participants continue to be exposed to avoidable risks as a result of biased underreporting of research. Limited resources for research continue to be wasted because of this. Again, are ethicists and research ethics committees reducing these problems? We made 3 recommendations concerning this particular issue. Require registration of clinical trials at inception as a condition of approval. Require a commitment by investigators to make the results publicly accessible as a condition of approval, and audit the reporting of results of research previously approved by the research ethics committees. Third charge, some ethicists and research ethics committees are behaving unethically by promoting a double standard on informed consent to treatment. Here I want to read for you a paper that I co-authored with an American pediatrician called Bill Silverman in 1987. We wrote, there's another more pervasive way in which double standards operate to promote poorly controlled experiments on uninformed patients. Illogically, and with no empirical evidence to support it, a mischievous view has been promoted that the interests of the vast number of patients involved in the poorly controlled experiments of informal medical tinkering are less in need of protection than are those of the relatively small number of patients who are involved in planned, properly controlled clinical experiments. That brings to mind the diethylstilbestrol example again. So the consequences of this double standard are, as Richard Smithles, a British pediatrician, said in 1975, I need permission to give a drug to half of my patients and a control group, a control preparation in the other half, but not if I want to give it to them all, not if I want to give the drug to all of them. This confusing real-world situation, John Lantos, a medical ethicist, said, seems to reflect a confused ethical analysis. Images and language reflect and promote the flawed notion that providing treatments within controlled experiments is inherently riskier than providing the same treatments in routine clinical practice. So like this cover of Time magazine said, how medical testing has turned millions of us into human guinea pigs. The guinea pig analogy became famous in a book published in 1967 by Maurice Papworth, a British doctor, and was the principal stimulus for the creation of research ethics committees in the UK. Let me be clear, the book drew attention to some scandalous examples of unethical experimentation, mainly preclinical research, and it caused quite a stir. Now, a few years later, a decade later, he wrote in the World Medicine, a wonderful magazine which is now defunct, about the functions of medical ethics committees. I responded to his article by saying, I share much of Dr. Papworth's concern about medical experimentation. However, I'm not so sure as he seems to be that the medical world could be neatly divided into clinical experimenters, the bad guys, and altruistic clinicians, the good guys. It seems very possible to me that there is a more urgent need to protect patients from the uncontrolled experimentation which characterizes much, quotes, accepted medical practice by altruistic but scientifically uncritical clinicians. No response to that. And then when another decade had passed and he wrote this article for the BMJ called Human Guinea Pigs, A History, I went in to the correspondence columns again, drawing attention to his use of the words experiment and experimentation. And I tried and pointed out that I had many years previously tried to encourage him to clarify what he meant by these words. And then in this letter that I sent, it's not shown here, I used the diethyl stilbestrol, the DES example, to ask this question: who behaved more ethically? The doctors who had done controlled trials of diethyl stilbestrol and abandoned the use of the drug when they found there was no evidence that it was helpful, or those who continued to use it despite the lack of good evidence that it was useful, only to find that it had been causing intergenerational cancer and other problems. I went on to say the specific example is unimportant, but the general issue that it illustrates is one which many medical ethicists seem unwilling to confront straightforwardly. Influential commentators on medical ethics like Dr. Papworth owe it to those of us who have been asking them to justify their apparent double standards for more than a decade to explain their position more clearly. This medical ethicist, Richard Ashcroft, said, for ethical as well as scientific reasons, when there is properly informed uncertainty about the relative merits of alternative treatments, the trial itself is the treatment. One of the consequences of the double standard on informed consent to treatment is hyperregulation of research. Clinical researchers are being strangled by red tape. Consequence is this from the double standard. This is from a paper published in one of the Christmas issues of the BMJ, in fact, the 2001 Christmas issue of the BMJ, in co-authorship with Andy Oxman and David Sackett. So you've got basically two models here. You have the smiling doctor and smiling patient on the left, and the words associated with that are, here's a prescription for Zapit, Ms. Jones. Let me know if you have any troubles. By contrast, with rather the grim-looking face of a clinical researcher on the right of the picture and a worried-looking Ms. Jones, and there, what is said, Zapit is a drug that's been used for many decades, Ms. Jones. We believe it might be helpful for what ails you, but we're not certain. Therefore, we're conducting a randomized trial. If you want to be a guinea pig in this trial, you'll need to read this 126-page informed consent form that includes a list of 528 possible side effects. You will also need to sign a legal contract to protect me, the investigators, the manufacturers of Zapit, their stockholders, and our ethics committee from lawsuits should we unintentionally kill you along the way. So the third verdict is the double standard on informed consent to treatment is logically indefensible and acts against the interests of patients and the public. It results in a disincentive to address uncertainties about the effects of treatments. Again, how are ethicists and research ethics committee reducing these problems? Well, in addition to the recommendations that we made for them in that paper, we'll add two more now to support those who wish to address uncertainties about the effects of treatments and to promote a single standard on informed consent to treatment. So the overall verdict is, in answer to the question posed in the title of this talk, my conclusion is that unaccountable research ethics committees cannot be trusted to help protect patients and the public. Is my verdict too harsh? Am I out of date? Are the recommendations proposed unreasonable or unworkable? Have the problems and solutions I've been wittering on about since 1978 been solved? Am I overlooking ways in which ethicists and members of research ethics committees are actually being held accountable for their prescriptions, proscriptions, or lack of either of these? Do my vested interests account for my continued promotion of the recommendations in our 1996 BMJ article and in my complaints about the double standard on informed consent to treatment and its adverse effects? Well, my vested interests are as a patient who wants access to effective, safe treatment, and as a citizen who wants more cost-effective investment in research to assess the effects of treatments. And I'm keen to be involved in well-designed research myself. This medical emergency card contains this statement: invite me to participate in any randomized controlled trials for which I am potentially eligible. If patients and citizens can't be relied on research ethics, can't rely on research ethics committees to look after their best interests, people themselves need to be helped to acquire the knowledge to defend their interests. We produced, I say we, this is Imogen Evans, a doctor, Hazel Thornton, a breast cancer patient, and I produced a book published in 2006 to try and give people the information they would need to look after their interests. And that was republished in 2011 with an added author, Paul Glasziou, a Australian general practitioner. And it's now in 20 different languages. And the important thing to be said about them, if you go to that website, you can get free for download in any of the languages. And there are also audio books in at least English and Spanish. There may be more by now. That book, when Andy Oxman, a researcher in Oslo, read it, prompted Andy to ask the question, can African primary school children learn how to assess treatment claims? He collected, as you'll see in the middle of this slide, a wonderful team to actually test that idea among Ugandan primary school kids, whom you see all the way around the periphery of the slide. What did we do? It was called the Informed Health Choices Project. I should have mentioned I was very, very pleased and proud to be a member of the team. First of all, identified the key concepts needed to assess treatment claims and illustrated those key concepts using stories told with cartoons in this cartoon book. We then took 120 schools and randomly allocated them either to have teaching with the book or not, the control group. The results were published in The Lancet and reported a large improvement in the ability of children to assess claims about the effects of treatments. And they show that it's possible to teach primary school children to think critically in schools with large student-to-teacher ratios and few resources. That's now in 10 languages and being tested in other places, and you can find out more through that website. While that was going on in Uganda and Norway, a lovely initiative was started in Ireland, started as the Schools Teaching Awareness and Randomized Trials. And I came to find out about this, I think it must have been in the mid-2000s, and something like 2015 maybe. And in 2017, a randomized trial was designed by children at a school who wanted to address the question, does listening to music improve memory recall, or are our parents right and it's a distraction? That was done by Cloggins Hill National School. And here's the team that were responsible for this great idea for a randomized controlled trial. You see Declan Devane, a proud godfather of this initiative. But you know, those were primary school kids. What about children even earlier than that? This statement, "Give me a child until he's 7 and I will show you the man," is attributed both to Aristotle and Ignatius Loyola. And here is Millie Chalmers learning to be a BS detector by reaching up for Ben Goldacre's book, Bad Science, which is endorsed on the front cover of the book by her grandfather. So, what is the basis for the action plans and things that people can do in the light of this evidence? I'm going to take two elements which relate to this talk from this list of actions proposed in this book. First, to promote the research on the effects of treatments, quite simply, and encourage and work with health professionals, researchers, research funders, and others who are trying to promote research to address inadequately answered questions about the effects of treatment, which you regard as important. But only if the proposed research meets scientific and ethical principles. Agree to participate in a clinical trial only on condition that the study protocol has been registered and made publicly available, that the protocol refers to systematic reviews of existing evidence showing that the trial is justified, and that you receive a written assurance that the full study results will be published and sent to all participants who indicate that they wish to receive them. Thank you for bearing with me till the end of this presentation. I leave you with some thoughts from Carl Sagan, the cosmologist, for you to read for yourself while we change speakers. Thank you.